Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Good evening and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Lindsay Whitehurst, political reporter with the Associated Press, Riley Roche, political reporter with Deseret News, and Ben Wood, reporter for the Salt Lake Tribune. Thank you all for being here with us today. Another interesting week in politics. And so I'd like to get into a couple issues, but I want to start with the high-level one. I get calls from reporters and from all of you from time to time. And one of the questions I often get is, how does the President of the United States impact races in the state of Utah? Candidates are trying to find their own way of how to deal with that factor, for or against, depends on the side. And so, Ben, I want to start with you. In a recent poll the Hinckley Institute of Politics did, the approval of Donald Trump, 51% approve, this is Utahns, 48% disapprove, and only 1% said they don't know. Very interested to see what you think about those particular numbers and how a political candidate today navigates a 51% approval.
Yeah, it's a very low number for a Republican president in Utah. A midterm election, conventional wisdom is that it is a referendum on the sitting president. You often see the opposing party gaining seats in the House. And where that manifests most in the state is in our 4th congressional district race. The lower that number gets for President Trump, the more of a tricky situation Representative Love is in defending her seat.
Well, Lisa, how does she do that? So Mia Love, she's trying to chart her own path. We'll talk more about her numbers in just a moment. But how does she handle that?
Well, it is a difficult situation for her because not just because of Trump's popularity in the state, but because of her voting record with Donald Trump. More than 97% of the time, she has voted with the president. And that's a number that her opponent, Ben McAdams, the Salt Lake County mayor, has used repeatedly against her. So she has to take this stand of supporting the president when he's doing what she thinks is right for the district, and then opposing him when he's not. But the problem is we don't see a lot of that opposition. And so people who aren't quite sure about Trump do end up having questions about whether a candidate who supports him so much of the time is right for them.
That's so interesting. So, Lindsay, because I want to break out this piece one more time, because some of the fun is in the kind of the notes that come after, right, when you start breaking down the tabs of these voters, because 77% of Republicans in that group said that they support, and 92% of the Democrats disapprove of the president. So I'm just kind of curious. So this Mia Love question that was just so insightful. So you have a lot of Republicans for, a lot of Democrats against, that little middle. How does she carve that out?
It's a good question, and I think one thing you see her doing is emphasizing the issues where she does disagree with the president, where she has publicly disagreed with him, like immigration, like trade, those issues that I think are also important to Utah voters. I think immigration is one of those issues that Utah voters are of course, conservative, but tend to be compassionate on the immigration issue. And so I think that where she has, and she has publicly called him out, there was that time he used the expletive to describe the country her parents come from, and she has publicly criticized him, and on trade as well. She's disagreed with his positions there, and where of course McAdams comes back is to say, does that rhetoric translate into action? Does that mean that anything, any real differences from the president? But of course, with this president in particular, I think that that public criticism it means something. You know, it's rhetoric is not necessarily always just rhetoric on it. So,
Lisa, one follow-up on that point. Because the president just this week has started trying to develop the rally cry for this coming election cycle and for the next one for him. And immigration, as Lindsay just mentioned, seems to be the Republican thing to talk about. How does that resonate in Utah, and how will that impact not this election, but even the one to follow?
I've been interested to see that in the 4th district, it's being brought up. But so much of the campaigning has been focused on negative attacks against one candidate against the other, that we really haven't had a very substantive discussion about immigration and where Utah is on that. And it's pretty much non-existent in most of the other races as well. I mean, it comes up during debates, comes up from time to time, but it hasn't really been a key issue, which you think it would be, given the fact that President Trump, as you say, is making this sort of a rallying cry to generate enthusiasm among his base. I think the latest thing is he's threatened now to call out the military to close the U.S. border with Mexico. And yet, we're not talking about that here. We're talking about FEC reports and all these other issues that are coming up in a lot of the negative advertising you're seeing in the 4th District.
Okay, we're going to have to talk about the FEC investigation now, since you brought that up, and it's so important. And Ben, let's start with you before Lisa responds to that and explains a little bit what happened, because as you reported in the Tribune just this last week, this race, McAdams and Love, are at a tie, 46%. In the state of Utah, 8% undecided. Okay, just give a commentary on that and how this has evened out the way it has.
It's somewhat incredible. We're not used to seeing this type of competition in our races here in the state, especially at a federal election level. You know, this race is in a dead heat, and we're looking at that last 8% of voters who are still making up their minds. They're looking for a reason to push themselves towards one candidate or the other. And in the midst of this, we have this very negative, very mudslingy debate going on about a wonky subject, campaign finance violations, something that the typical voter probably doesn't spend too much time thinking about.
Lisa, I think we need to explain this a little bit. All right, so what happened with this FEC letter and why Utah is unique and what happened to that primary that prompted the letter?
How much time do you have?
Okay.
That's the problem with this issue. It is very complicated. I mean, basically what you have is candidates file FEC financial disclosures on a regular basis, basically quarterly, although there's some additional reporting. And they have to declare whether the money they collect from donors is for a primary or a general election, except that in Utah we have that third cycle, a convention cycle, because we still have the option, we've always had the option of candidates being nominated at convention for the general election ballot and skipping a primary. And now, of course, with SB 54, there is a dual path to the primary ballot. But in Mia Love's case, she had no primary opposition. No Republicans ran against her. So the question is, how long can she collect money for a primary election she's not going to have? Is it until the filing deadline? Is it until the party's convention in April where she's formally nominated, or is it until the actual June primary date? So at issue is how much she collected for a primary election. The FEC sent a letter questioning what she had submitted, and she agreed to what they call redesignate funds that were collected after the convention deadline for the general election. But there's now been a formal complaint filed by a better government group, a progressive better government group called the Alliance for a Better Utah, that is still under investigation. The FEC took a rather extraordinary step of issuing, well, issuing is the wrong word, responding via email to an attorney hired by Mia Love to deal with this FEC issue, to say that she didn't have to do anything more to keep the funds that she collected through a certain deadline. But it's as Ben said, I mean, it's very wonky, it's very confusing. And you have now the accusations just flying back and forth.
So let's talk about those, because you're right, it's wonky. You know, who really follows FEC rules and letters and memos, unless of course they end up in a commercial, right, Lindsay? Which they have.
I think, yes, exactly. I think that's the thing. It gets very complicated, but if you can create enough smoke, that you might kind of push a voter one way or the other. Most voters aren't going to try and page through every single word of what's happening here. But if a voter who's maybe on the fence sees a commercial that attaches words like scandal and illegal to Mia Love's name, that could maybe say, well, you know, I know she denies it, but if there's smoke, there must be something going on here. So I think I'm going to vote against her. And the campaign very much knows that. And I think especially in the last few days, that's why you see them releasing written emails and sort of putting out their own rhetoric that's calling on challenger Ben McAdams to step down and things like that. And so that's why I think you see some heightened talk here, is because both sides kind of know if we can create enough smoke, enough sort of suspicion, that might kind of bounce somebody one way or the other.
So how effective will this be? Because we do know that a statement did come from the FEC saying, you know, we're fine on the first part, right? Not necessarily on all of it.
Not
on all of it. All right. So is the damage done done in your mind as you talk with people in the state of Utah, or do you think she can rehabilitate that particular issue?
Well, I don't think the Democrats are going to stop on this issue. I don't think they accept the email, and they can certainly say the Alliance for Better Utah complaint is still open. I don't think this is something that they're going to roll over and say, well, you know what, they're right. We're gonna stop talking about this, and therefore I don't think the Love campaign is going to stop trying to refute those allegations, so to speak. So I don't think we're going to see this issue die. But is it something that your average Joe voter gets real concerned about? I'm still not totally sure about that.
Well, I think you're right. I think the issue itself is not necessarily one that's going to engage a lot of voters. Oh, FEC regulations. Let's take a look at those and see how closely they were followed. No, I totally agree with that. But it's like a lot of things in politics, right? It's how you react. Mm-hmm. And what I found really interesting is I've heard from a number of political observers that they were really surprised that Representative Love keeps bringing this issue back.
Interesting.
Lindsay and I were at the debate on Monday between Love and McAdams, and right before they started, we were given a statement from Representative Love saying that she had talked, or someone on her campaign had talked to this unnamed FEC analyst and been assured everything was fine, and she's basically completely cleared. Well, that wasn't the case. We were told that we would be able to talk to this person. In fact, she invited the media after the debate. Call this person. They'll tell you everything I've told you. Well, they wouldn't, because they don't talk to the media. So she brought this issue back up, and it's now dragged on several days.
Which did not generate a day of the headlines I think the Love campaign would have liked to have seen there. And so, yeah, I think that's another one, like you said, will this issue in particular tip somebody? Maybe not, but if there can be enough smoke, enough sort of getting enraged around it, it's possible for a few people, and in a tight race, every little thing could matter.
Yeah, it's true.
Right?
Ben, what are people saying about the call from Mia Love this week? Say, Ben, you need to withdraw from the race because you pursued this the way you did.
I think most people think that was probably a step too far in this case. I mean, we have the Love campaign, which has redesignated and has refunded some of their donations. You don't do that unless there's been an error. So there's been some acknowledgement on her campaign's part that some T's needed crossing, some I's needed dotting. Mm-hmm. To then call on your opponent to step down because of errors your campaign made in campaign finance violations, it's an extraordinary step. I don't think too many people watching this race expected him to drop out, or even a half measure expected that to really be a compelling argument to make. And that's why our coverage yesterday was so focused on her calling him to drop out, because like Lisa said, we've gone beyond the issue of these violations. We're now talking about the reaction and the way the campaigns are addressing them.
That's what voters care about, not necessarily a specific issue, but how the candidates react. And how strongly they react. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I want to talk about how some of our local elected officials are reacting to some of the initiatives, the propositions we'll be voting for during this next election. Lindsay, I want to talk about Proposition 2 on medicinal marijuana. The poll that we put out this week, 52% of Utahns support, 46 oppose, which is a huge difference from where we were just a very short time ago. Tell us why you think that number has slipped so much in the state, from about 67% down to 52.
Well, I think the big thing you've got to point to is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints coming out against it and taking the unusual step to talk publicly, call a press conference, get together a whole sort of coalition of people who are against the idea. I mean, I think you've got to look at that, and I think the numbers bear that out to an extent, right? I think there is the support among active Latter-day Saints is really not as strong. And then, of course, there was this compromise deal that's come around, so that may also have to do with it, is to say, well, we don't need to vote for this proposition anymore because we've come to a compromise. We've gone the Utah way and done this. Come up with our own ideas, and this is going to happen. People are going to get it, and they're going to get it with these stricter regulations in a way that that church leaders and others who are concerned about can find more palatable.
Interesting. On this compromise, Ben, what Lindsay just said was very insightful. I'm curious about how that impacts the kind of the trust level, because the legislature is going to have to do something, right? So let's just say I'm okay with the compromise. Do Utahns trust the legislature to do what they agreed to do?
Well, that's one question. And just the level of uncertainty injected into this because of the negotiated compromise is huge. We don't know exactly what we're voting on anymore, and we've turned Proposition 2 into quasi-binding opinion question number 2. I mean, we're voting on something that we've been told will never be enacted, and something else will. So there's not only the question of how lawmakers will react to a passage or failure of Proposition 2, there's also just a question of what this deal is that we'll be debating a month from now after the election.
Do you think we know what the deal is?
Well, I think we heard from lawmakers on Wednesday during their interim meetings. The Republican supermajority caucused in private, and I think both sides feel that they have the votes to pass the compromise. The compromise was crafted with a large coalition of groups that also included the outgoing legislative leadership in both the Senate and the House. And they were relying on lawmakers that have worked on medical marijuana legislation in the past to come up with something. So in a sense, you're right. There is some uncertainty here. What do I do as a voter with this issue, depending on how I feel, knowing that this compromise is pretty much set to be passed in November, but at the same time, without the knowing, we know what the compromise is. There was a hearing on it. There will be another hearing before the special session. What could have happened is we could have just been told, well, lawmakers aren't happy with Prop 2, which they weren't, and plan to come back at some point, whether it was in a special session or whether it was in the general session, and change it to what they wanted. Now we know what it will be, and we can decide.
Let me throw up a quote from the Speaker of the House, Greg Hughes, to your great point, because I want you to see where this goes with the great insight you just gave. This is what he just said this week after we were talking about the compromise. He said, the compromise is not a porcelain doll. It is not a Cinderella slipper that you can't touch.
If I were a supporter of Prop 2, that might make me nervous.
Well, that's what I'm wondering about. So what does that mean?
It sounds to me like we're going to get together and talk about that. And that is how this process works, right? That's a legislative process. People get together on two sides. They figure out what they can live with and what kind of compromise they can get into. But at the same time, you know, we had a big press conference where legislative leaders stood up and said, we are going to push this through. It's going to happen. But there were, of course, some Prop 2 supporters who were not on board with that. You know, some vocal ones who said, look, we are still skeptical. And for those skeptics, if somebody's saying, remember what we said before, it might change, I can see somebody being nervous about that.
But let's remember, we're talking about a special session of the legislature. We're not talking about the general session where there is a lot of room for discussion and change. Special session will not be called unless there are the votes on this specific compromise. The bill's already been heard, and as I said, it's anticipated it will be heard a second time before the special session, which is scheduled for mid-November, during the regular interim meetings.
And of course, you have a guy that's widely named as a possible gubernatorial candidate, you know, and to have Greg Hughes get up and say, we're going to do this, and then to really have a big change and renege on that, it wouldn't look good. So I think there are some political reasons why you could expect, you know, him to stick to his word to it and not make huge changes.
Well, and there was some question too, because the leadership that negotiated this compromise, right, Speaker Hughes and President Niederhauser, neither of them are running for re-election, and so will be out of leadership. So how much pull will they have with their bodies? Well, we found out on Wednesday.
Well, and to Lisa's point, I'm less curious about what's going to happen in November. I'm more curious about what happens in January, February, and March. Because the general session is right around the corner. And this is an issue like alcohol, like so many things that we debate every year. So yeah, I would imagine that the bulk of this compromise will probably be debated. It'll be voted up and down. But then they come right back in January, and this whole thing starts again.
Okay, I think we need to take the same theme forward, because this exact same issue is happening on Proposition 3 just this week, right? This was the proposition which would fully expand Medicaid in the state, increasing the state sales tax by 0.15%. I want to give you the polling numbers because I want to talk about what the legislature is going to do with this. 59% of Utahns, as of this last week, support, 33 oppose. All right, this is an issue our legislature has not loved in the past.
Well, our House Speaker did not love in the past and really drove the opposition to that. The Senate passed the governor's form of Medicaid expansion, and the Senate or the House killed it under Speaker Hughes. And then the legislature met privately with representatives of the governor and others to come up with what was supposed to be a sellable compromise. And once again, it died in the House. So, I mean, it never even got out of the House Republican caucus. So I think with Speaker Hughes out of the picture, we're going to see this treated differently. What's been interesting to me about this especially is that it just has not gotten the attention that the other propositions have. And yet this was a huge issue in the state, and it has a huge impact
and
on the
very
state.
popular. I mean, those numbers in favor of it are, you know, they look really good.
So I want to show you another quote, though, because Speaker Hughes is not probably going to take this one up this time, but someone else has. So I want to show you the comment that came after this week, after these polling numbers came out. This is from Senator Anderegg. He said, with the public vote, I don't think that that's sacrosanct. If we don't repeal Prop 3 and the numbers turn out where we think they are, I don't know how we're going to fund it. This is almost like you can vote on it, but we're not going to put this in play.
Well, put that in political context, though. Senator Anderegg has always been an opponent of expanding Medicaid. I think at one point he wanted the state to rely on charity care for people that couldn't afford health care. So he is a member of the Senate. He was a member of the House at that point when he opposed Medicaid expansion. He's a member of the Senate. He's not in leadership. We'll see where that goes.
I say it's still a bold statement, right? There's something that polls are showing 70% of people support, and him saying, well, we should probably not do it.
People always supported Medicaid expansion in the polls. It's always been popular with Utahns because Utahns do care about their fellow citizens. They do care that people don't have health care or that they've fallen in a gap because of the way the Affordable Care Act was structured and made too much to qualify for the type of health care that's available and too little to get the subsidies that many other people get.
To approve a proposition into law, though, that's a whole nother step. It's not just an opinion poll. If it does pass, you know, to take something that the people have passed into a law and repeal it, that's a big step. And I've heard other lawmakers on that subject, on the ballot proposition subject, I think, much more reluctant to sort of overturn something that's been approved by a ballot measure. But this is a whole new world on ballot measures. We have a lot more than we've had in a long time. So it could be a really different world
it's true,
next year.
But take this going to this next legislative session, and Ben, take a second on this, because if the legislature said, let's take the hypothetical, it passes and they decide they need to repeal in some way. I'm not saying they will, but this will be the argument, right, from Senator Anderegg anyway, which is, hey, it's a matter of what we can afford and what we can't afford. So if we're going to pay for this, we're not going to pay for whatever these other things are, right? Ben, is that the argument? How far does that go?
That'll be the argument. It is interesting that the same day Senator Anderegg made that statement, the state announced a $250 million surplus. So we will see lots of arguments based on money. And like Lee said, Senator Anderegg is a member of the Senate. He's not the Senate president. He's not on the leadership team. I recently spoke with Representative Spenlove, who sponsored the state's Medicaid expansion plan. I asked him, if Prop 3 passes, will you try to repeal it? He said no. He said, if the voters vote for this, we'll give it a shot. We'll take it from there. But there is always going to be this question about paying for it.
Okay. So what if it passes 52%, 50%?
That's where things get a little dicier. If it barely passes, you know, if it has a plurality, you know, vote and we have a low turnout, who knows? But yeah, I mean, we're absolutely going to see some senators, some lawmakers, Senator Anderegg among them, trying to repeal this. We'll have a debate. But as Lindsay was saying, there's going to be some districts where this is more popular than others, and the representatives of those districts will be in a tighter spot.
Well, he said that, in fact, right?
He did.
In his district? Just
fine.
I
said, in my district, no one's going to care if I repeal this thing. My colleagues will see.
Okay, very good. I want to talk about one positive thing. Wait, is that not all positive?
There's a positive?
There's good
I'm
news.
going to find a positive. Yes, I'm going to find a positive. According to the Lieutenant Governor, just this week, Utah registered 23,612 new voters in the last 30 days. That's pretty positive, right? Lindsay, you're out there on the streets talking to particularly the younger voters. What's motivating them this year to register, and are they going to show up?
Well, you know, that's one of the big questions, right? But we've also got our mail-in ballot system, which is a whole new thing. You don't even have to show up, which you hear a lot from young people. You hear the March for Our Lives things. You hear those sort of more kind of progressive issues is what I hear from a lot of young people I've talked to. So it'll be interesting to see how those kind of shake down in terms of voting. Because of course this year you can also register at the polls for the first time. You don't even have to register ahead of time. You can show up day of and cast your ballot. So that'll be interesting. I think it could have an impact on the Prop 2 too. It'll be interesting to see how that might be affected by all these new voters. And because I think it's the kind of issue people have strong feelings about, get emotional about, and they come out to vote even if they don't normally do that.
That's true. And I'm curious on these propositions, and there's some of the candidates also, but that's an 866% increase. That's pretty good. So I'm curious, Ben, take just a second on this thing. Are people motivated by these propositions? Is that why we're seeing such interest this year?
Yes. I mean, there's a bigger answer, but I mean, this really shows the power of competitive races in bringing people out to the vote. These are statewide ballot propositions. We haven't had a competitive statewide race in my lifetime, to be honest. This year we do. And I mean, it just shows when you have questions that really could go either way, people want to cast their vote in that situation. They want to go out, they want to be heard.
But Lisa, so let's just say a bunch of folks are showing up, say, for Proposition 2 on medicinal marijuana. How is that impacting some of these other races then? If you're Mia Love, who's the only incumbent in a close race right now, how does that impact that race and that turnout?
Well, you have to be careful the position you take on those initiatives, right? On those propositions now, if you're in a close race. And Lindsay and I saw that in the debate, right? I mean, Mayor McAdams said he was voting for Proposition 2, but Representative Love never really gave us a clear answer on how she was going to vote, although she said she supported medical marijuana and then talked about it in terms of what the compromise would provide. So she's trying to walk that very fine line. But back to
It's going to be the last point.
Okay, I was just going to say, let's not forget President Trump has probably motivated a lot of people on both sides, because we see that elections have real consequences, and we see the effects of maybe not voting when you have that opportunity.
Okay. Thank you very much for your insights today. That's it for tonight's show. For more discussion and past episodes, please join us online at kued.org/Hinckley Report. We'll see you next week. Thank you and good night.